5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Olkaa hyvä.
Hello and welcome to this Finland Azure User Group panel discussion. This is actually the last event we have for you before we go on a summer vacation, and I think all our participants here are also waiting for their summer vacations pretty eagerly. So first, let's talk a little bit about what Finland Azure User Group is. So FAUG is the largest tech user group in Finland, and we are supporting over 1.8k members at the moment in Meetup. And we do roughly 10 events yearly, and lately they have been virtual events, but today we have something special for you in store. And last thing is that if you want to find more information about us, try the Meetup or try our YouTube channel, where you are probably looking at this presentation already. Next, let's go through our sponsors. So today we are sponsored by Microsoft, who are making this all possible. Thank you a lot to them. And now let's move to our panelists. So today with me, Pasi Huuhka, I have here Masi Malmi from Polar Squad and Teemu Tapanila from Malo. So I'll let the guys present themselves and introduce themselves now, and then we'll get back to me afterwards. So Teemu, go ahead.
So hello, my name is Teemu Tapanila. I'm a CTO of Malo. Malo is Azure-focused consulting company. We do basically Azure advisory and Azure DevOps. I have been basically doing 8 years of Azure, mainly doing developer-focused BaaS, not that much virtual machines, everything fun and cool for developers especially. And that's basically where I've been doing focus lately, especially IoT.
All right. What about you, Masi?
Hi, my name is Masi Malmi. I come from a company called Polar Squad. We are specialized in DevOps consultancy. I'm the Azure lead there, and I have something like over 10 years of background in .NET development and solution architecture, and lately more with the public clouds.
All right. And I'm Pasi Huuhka, as I already mentioned. I'm a DevOps architect at Azure at the moment. So basically, I'm also one of the organizers in Azure User Group here. And lately, I have been working on a lot with Bicep, and I'm mostly doing DevOps stuff here. And I'm also an Azure MVP. So today's agenda is pretty much just 3 friends here discussing DevOps on Azure. So we'd like to start with kind of the elephant in the room. Our first subject here, Azure DevOps versus GitHub. So we feel that Microsoft's official position here is quite unclear, and at least I myself get constantly asked kind of what is happening with Azure DevOps. Is it going away, or is basically GitHub replacing it? And we were Masi discussing a couple of days ago on our thoughts about this, and to me it seems that Microsoft's official position can be fetched from random podcasts, and there kind of is no real official way of doing things or so far. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's been like this since, I don't know, a year and a half ago when GitHub Actions came into play. So since Microsoft acquired GitHub, and one of the things they first realized is that they need some kind of tooling for CI/CD for building pipelines also directly in GitHub, and that's when they started working on GitHub Actions. And ever since then, there's been this constant discussion about so how do we go forward? Like we have like two different tools for doing the same thing basically. So Microsoft, tell us which one should we choose?
Yeah, it seems that even though Microsoft kind of wants to tell to us that they are just 2 different things for 2 different purposes or so on, but it's kind of clear that they are somewhat fighting with each other at least.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like mainly you can see that most of the new things lately, if you look at the build, there wasn't even a single session about Azure DevOps. If you look at other conferences, there hasn't been a single session about Azure DevOps. If you look at, for example, Azure Web App Static version, it was only support on GitHub. So clearly you can see that there has been a change in direction. So they're clearly aiming for GitHub first, Azure DevOps second, even though they are not publicly saying that. There is no public statement of what's going to happen or when is stuff going to happen, which I would say it's pretty typical Microsoft, is that they are not announcing things until they're ready to announce it. But normally it has not been taking this long. I think this has been a very long period where there hasn't been any official communication. At least, like, I haven't seen any official communication, and I don't think anybody has seen any official communication. But there has been lots of unofficial statements in different events, different podcasts, different blog posts and everything. And I think that's a little bit frustrating.
Yeah, I tend to agree. If you take a look at both of the products kind of roadmap, you can see that both are getting some features, and I think Microsoft has said that GitHub is trying to reach feature parity, like you said, with Azure DevOps. But if they want to hit that, it's almost kind of strange to me that they still have kind of this moving target that they are then trying to hit if they are doing stuff in Azure DevOps also. But if you think about it, a lot of large companies still are using and starting to use Azure DevOps. So it's very unlikely that it's really going anywhere anytime soon. So there's no reason at least to panic, even if Microsoft would be saying that GitHub is kind of the way to go. And regarding the podcast that you mentioned,
we put it in the show notes. This podcast we're talking about from Apple One, but basically also Microsoft themselves is using Azure DevOps very heavily inside the house. It's like it's powering most of their like CI/CD pipelines and everything. So it's not going away in a year or two, or not even 5 years, maybe 10 years. I don't know. Could be. Like, we are waiting to see when is this feature parity going to be reached between Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions, but only time will tell.
Yeah,
I generally see it so that currently they're aiming for feature parity. I would say estimate next year, like next year summer-ish. They will be okay enough that you could start thinking about like, hey, let's start using GitHub. And after that, they're going to start the normal Microsoft way, which is building a migration tools, bringing a migration guidance, starting to tell the partners and everybody that, hey, now is the time to migrate, and here's a little bit bonus if you do. And then it finally will start. But I think that's still a year away. But you can already see that there's lots of Microsoft salespeople who are pushing that, hey, GitHub is cool, and that's because they are getting bonus if they sell GitHub, which I totally get that there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a very, I would say that currently, if you're a huge enterprise thinking about doing CI/CD, source control, and work item tracking, I don't think that GitHub is there yet. I don't think that you can literally like. It's a very rare cases where it currently fits well. And if you compare, for example, Azure DevOps work item tracking to GitHub work item tracking, they are in a totally different planet. Some might say that GitHub is very straightforward, very easy to use, but the whole thing is that it's very easy to use if it fits your needs. But it only fits certain needs, and there is no real customization. Azure DevOps is very much like, you can customize it a lot to fit your need, but it normally needs some customization. So it's more like a custom product versus ready-made product. And the custom one is better for larger enterprises. The ready-made is good for smaller or medium-sized, or if you're ready to adopt all of your processes into that one. And the same thing with the whole GitHub versus Azure DevOps is that I think GitHub is way more opinionated, meaning that there is ready-made solution for how do you do controls, how do you do item tracking, how do you do permissions, build pipelines. Like, there is no options between classic and YAML or anything like that. There's there's a single way, and that's the way. Like there's no discussion. And you either like that or you don't.
I remember when I first time tried GitHub Actions, and I think first thing I was frustrated with was, how do I manually trigger a pipeline? It was not possible. I needed to create a tag, and based on that tag, like when it appears in the source control, then it will trigger a run.
And yeah, going back to what Teemu was saying, I think that it's very visible that Azure DevOps kind of is an enterprise way of doing things, whereas GitHub clearly has this developer focus. And developers, of course, want to do things as quickly as possible and as simply as possible, but when you get to an enterprise kind of field, it kind of requires some extra approvals and whatnot to kind of add on top of that.
Yeah, the enterprises really need those options when they want to be able to, bring their own processes into that.
Exactly. I don't think that it's a question of like something being better or worse. I would say currently they are very, very different products, and I think they're going to come closer together. In the future, I think there's going to be more simplicity. Like you can see that there is a work item type called Basic in Azure DevOps, which is way more like we want to make this more closer to Trello and GitHub, the whole Azure DevOps work items, and you can see that GitHub is getting more things are like more permissions, more GitHub actions getting more like options. So you can clearly see that they are coming closer together, but it's just taking a long time.
Yeah, Teemu, you mentioned that you wouldn't move to GitHub yet, but what would be those kind of features that you would like to have there before actually moving there? Or?
That's a very good question. I think there is two things that are a little bit unclear. First one is pricing. I think that's a very interesting question, is that the pricing of GitHub is not super clear for enterprise customers. Azure DevOps is cheap. Like if you are house that's doing currently .NET, Azure DevOps is basically free. GitHub is not free. And GitHub pricing is a little bit higher, and there is no, I would say, guarantee that it will not change, because they're constantly changing it a lot. So I'm expecting a price changes on GitHub. So that's like a little bit something that I would like to see more stability on that sense. Another thing is like, for example, identity handling. I mean, I'm a huge fan of believing that you should have one identity, and all of your actions and all of your basically things that you do should tie into that one identity. And basically the GitHub response to that is more like, hey, we just tied those identities together, and that's like, no. So that's a big thing, is that once they fix that identity, the pricing comes in place, and then the work items. And the work items is, I would say, the real, like, that's the one where I don't really see what is exactly going to be the future. Everything else is more like, it will just take time, like 3-4 months, and it's done. But the work items is something that I have no idea, like, might take a long while, might be a short while. Will be interesting to see.
Yeah, at least for me, when I think about what I would want, well, work item tracking kind of more flexibility on that is one thing. Identity is another. But then from CI/CD perspective, I would like to have kind of Azure DevOps like templating capabilities, because when your solution gets big, or you want to reuse your code, you don't want to write that again. And I think that they also know this, because if you look at the public roadmap, they can actually, or they have the templating there, I think in Q3 of this year. So it's coming pretty quickly. But also I would like then some extra polish on the kind of continuous deployment story there also. So Azure DevOps has that pretty well now, so you can create environments and whatnot and add checks to those directly. But GitHub is still kind of trying to work on all of those kinks there.
But like looking at the roadmaps, it's quite clear that Azure DevOps is not gaining that many new features anymore. It's more of like going into maintenance mode in that sense.
Yeah, but well, Azure DevOps does have the larger feature set still. So if you think about, well, if you start to kind of compare, let's say, the Azure repos versus GitHub repos, there's a lot more control on the Azure repos side yet. But then if you think about what do you actually get by going to GitHub, it's the security features, for example, which kind of come built in when your code is in GitHub. And I think that currently like Dependabot, which can checks your dependencies on your repository and automatically creates PRs for those for you to kind of just only run tests against and then approve, is a pretty good improvement in your efficiency of maintaining code. And also then CodeQL, which kind of already out of the box provides you with pretty cool kind of security features on spotting in your PR kind of flow, what are you actually doing wrong, what kind of security holes could be avoided already here. So kind of shifting left on the security side. And I kind of feel that, at least in my customers' side, I feel that security is still a little bit of kind of this that comes as an afterthought. So if you can improve that with just moving to GitHub, perhaps that's a very good reason to actually pay a little bit more for it also.
Yeah, and I think like that's one of the key things is that doing some security is way easier on GitHub. If you want to do security well on Azure DevOps, it's again, you need to build your custom stuff. But at the same time, most of the enterprises have their security processes that needs that custom stuff. So it's not like just put in a dependable bot or code quality analyzer. It's like, that's not enough. Like there is a certain process, like what happens when we have a dependency that's not up to date? Who's going to update it? What's the process to update it? So it's again like GitHub is getting those like nice things that out of the box they fit in a small scale. But when you go to larger scale, you cannot get those in GitHub. So it's generally, I would say, GitHub is absolutely going in the right direction. Azure DevOps is not getting that many new features, but at the same time, I don't have anything like Azure DevOps would absolutely need this. Like there's a very few things that I would say that this would make my life so much better if this would exist in Azure DevOps. The only things that basically I'm a little bit missing is like reporting. There is certain reporting capabilities that are not nicely built in Azure DevOps, but at the same time, the Azure DevOps API is amazing. It's the documentation is not amazing. The API is amazing, but basically you can build your own reporting on top of it. So that's the only thing that where I would see like it would be nice if they would put some effort on it. And if you look at the current roadmap, they are putting some effort on it. I would like a little bit more effort, but still, there is no absolutely that would make my life better. So I'm not worried. In that sense that even if there is not that many new features, I don't think that I would be telling that my customer like, hey, you have to move to get this new feature. There is no new feature on GitHub, and I don't see it coming anytime soon, anything large. So that's why I'm happy with the situation. What I'm not happy is the uncertainty, and that's like something that I think is a bad thing. Like it's problematic. Yeah. Not the state itself, but the problem that it's uncertain.
Yeah, and as time goes on, it's not getting any better if you don't actually answer that concern from your customers. So it's a difficult situation because you don't really want to cause any panic because there's nothing to panic about. But if somebody says that, hey, your company has just put millions of dollars into this product, and then the company doing that says that, hey, it's going away in X amount of years, that might cause your customer to be quite unhappy about the situation also.
Well, there needs to be a pretty good migration tool that can then move all those pipelines and everything. So
my current estimation is that I bet next 3 years an Azure DevOps is still fine. That's like 3 years. Sure. At least like 3 years I can promise. 5 is a little bit like but there might be something that you start missing out in next 5 years, but 3 years I would say pretty fine.
Yeah. And well, I know that at least kind of the leadership between GitHub and Azure DevOps teams is the same, so at least they kind of know what's happening on both sides and have that communication going, so it's pretty easy for them to actually go for that feature parity that we talked about. And also, if you think about how GitHub Actions are built on top of Azure pipelines kind of code initially, and they are, for example, using the same build agents. So it's if you're hosting your own kind of build agents, it will be very easy to just move those around to GitHub Actions in the future and so on. So that's kind of at least they know about this problem and are working on it. So it's not a dire situation in that case.
Yeah, and I think this is exactly one of those things that this will be fixed by time. But it's a little bit like this is the time that it's like a little bit like what is happening, and that's not like a nice feeling to have. But I think time will fix this. And generally, like if currently somebody wants to start with GitHub, go ahead. If somebody wants to start with Azure DevOps, go ahead. I would not be worried because the largest CI/CD pipelines that I have personally seen. Okay, I'm an Azure DevOps consultant. I only do Azure DevOps mainly. So the largest that I have seen are Azure DevOps, and they are massive. I mean, those companies are not going to move. Let's just say if they would today get a message that Azure DevOps will die tomorrow, they would be like, No, it's not. It's not going to do it. They would be basically doing anything to keep it alive. They will not be ready to migrate within 2-3 years, just because their processes are so heavily built on top of it.
Yeah.
So, and the same thing, Microsoft Office, Microsoft Windows, lots of Azure services are built on top of Azure DevOps. They are not going to pull the plug or do anything radical like that. So, yeah, not worried in that sense.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah, when we think about extensibility between those two platforms, have you guys built Azure DevOps extensions, for example, and compared to GitHub Actions, how do they feel?
Well, I've done some custom workflows on GitHub Actions. That was really easy.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, that part is easier in my sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, on Azure DevOps, it takes a bit more effort to to do those
I think
those custom tasks.
Yeah, in Azure DevOps it feels that perhaps the initial setup takes a little bit more work, but when you get the hang of it, then it's kind of just easy to make more of them. But at least I have worked with kind of pipeline decorators, which also use kind of these private extensions for our Azure DevOps. That's kind of pretty easy to just use the normal YAML logic there, but of course if you want to do your custom code, that's also possible. How about you, Teemu?
Yeah, I would agree. Like it's the same thing as everything else. GitHub, very nice way to get started. Very well taught in that sense. Azure DevOps, initial setup is harder. After that, it's very similar. But the initial setup being harder, I think that's a huge boundary for lots of people. It's the same thing of why ARM and Bicep. I'm a huge believer of ARM. I have been converted to Bicep now. Like these days, I'm let's just use Bicep, because the initial learning curve of Bicep, the same with GitHub Actions, is way lower. Which means that it's way easier to get started. It's way easier to get everybody on your team to be like, yeah, this makes sense. Because it's very frustrating that if you're pushing, for example, let's do custom extensions and you're the only person who can do them, that means that every time that there is a need for extension, it's going to be your responsibility. And on GitHub Actions, I think that most people would be like, yeah, absolutely, I can pull up a GitHub extension. It's not like GitHub Action extension. It's not that hard. And I think there's a huge value on just that proposition.
No. What about kind of the CLIs, for example? Both Azure DevOps and GitHub have their own CLIs, but I think that the GitHub CLI is kind of more focused on the developer experience again, because you can do pull requests pretty easily with that. But I have not seen at least anybody use the Azure DevOps CLI extension to actually do their work. It's more like automation on top of the platform. But yeah.
Yeah, that's what I would agree. I've never even thought about using it for my daily work.
Yeah.
But I use the Azure DevOps CLI a lot on the tasks when I want to automate and build something on top of the Azure DevOps, build pipeline triggering a pull request or that kind of stuff. Super nice and easy for that. But yeah, I've never even thought about doing doing daily work. But that's because when I'm doing coding, I'm either sitting or bicepping. I'm either sitting on Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, and the workflows in there is pretty good. I'm not looking forward to having a CLI for that. I don't need it.
Yeah, I suppose if you are doing kind of these tasks constantly doing some pulls commits, you might want to create your own kind of GitHub CLI macros, but I think also in that case I would probably just create kind of macros for Git instead of the GitHub CLI. But yeah. How about you? Do you have any?
I've used the Azure DevOps CLI mainly for documenting how the pipelines are initially created, because most of the logic or everything is in the YAML itself.
Yeah.
So you just tie in some variables or something, but mostly you just need the CLI for creating the pipeline.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've been using it for documentation.
Yeah.
Mainly.
That's a good use case, at least. I need to think about that myself in the future.
What is this documentation?
Yeah, somebody needs to be able to, take on.
You mean that isn't you?
No.
All right. But with that, let's move to our second subject, which is still closely related. So we have pipelines. GitHub, for example, only supports CI/CD with YAML code, and Azure DevOps has this classic feature also built in, which is a bit older. But how do you feel, when should you use which, and why?
That's a very interesting because initially when YAML came out, lots of people were like, absolutely, this is amazing. Then they started using it, they were like, this is not as amazing as it sounded. And again, my currently general advice is that if your team has a dedicated person to do DevOps, you should be using YAML. If your team doesn't have a dedicated person, you should be using Classic. Because Classic is something that everybody can click around and do stuff and change things, and it's easy to get started. If I give you a YAML file and say like, hey, please fix my pipeline, you're like, I have no idea what's happening here. You're just like it takes a while to get into it, and then because there is multiple ways of how you can build YAML pipelines, because they're flexible, they're nice, you can modularize them, you can inherit them, you can template them, and that's the whole like why they're amazing. That's also what makes them hard. Like if I get your YAML pipeline, I'm like, this will take a while. If I get your Classic pipeline, it takes me probably 4 minutes, and I can scream through it, and I understand what exactly it is doing.
Yeah, sometimes it's really hard to tell how long it will take when you start working on some new thing on the YAML. It requires some testing and tweaking. Let's see.
Yeah.
And then there's lots of like certain features which are missing still on the YAML, especially on Azure DevOps. Like there is lots of nice features which are related to release pipelines in a classic way, where you can like list different environments in a certain way. You can see which work item has a commit related, which has been deployed to certain environments. All of those features, I think they're coming to YAML, because the YAML has been getting constantly all of those new stuff.
What about queuing policies?
What policies? Exactly. Like there's a certain really advanced things which are still missing on YAML, which are enabled in the classic UI. And again, here we are seeing feature parity. When was YAML released? Like 2?
Yeah, it was already 3 or even longer.
2017 might have been the kind of real release. I think it might have been preview, but
it was first preview. You need to enable it separately.
But if you think that it's been 4 years, and they now, I would say they're now reaching feature parity. I would say that they're very close to feature parity now. I would say within a year they will start being way over Classic, which I think is totally fine. And again, here currently, I would still say like, if you have Classic, no worries. If you don't have dedicated people, use that. But in the future, of course, it's going to be more and more forward YAML. And I think YAML is a future. In certain cases, it's not there yet. That's my strong opinion here.
Yeah, I think I have 2 problems with YAML, even though we have moved 99% of our project to YAML, because basically we have kind of this baseline template that we start with from the CI/CD point of view, so it's kind of easy to copy and paste that stuff for different projects. But I feel that the editing experience is still pretty bad there. If you use the portal, there's this kind of assistant tool there that you can use pretty easily. But it's kind of hidden. You need to know where to click it open to get kind of this classic, similar to classic experience there. And you also get some intelligence on that part. But basically, if you try to do it with the VS Code extension, well, it kind of works. But if you have one if clause there somewhere, the whole thing breaks down. And I have been personally using just the normal YAML language kind of engine on VS Code myself, and not doing anything with the Azure pipelines themselves, because the extension is pretty much just unusable as soon as I add the if clause there somewhere. So yeah. And yeah, like you mentioned on the work item linking, that's kind of, at least for my customers, it seems that that is the only real feature that's sometimes blocking them from using them, because it's very useful to, in the classic one, to kind of get your linking for the work items directly into the work item itself. You can see where is this work item currently, but with YAML you need to go to the environments menu in Azure DevOps, for example, and try to figure out from this build name or identity what is kind of the version that's currently in my environment. And if you think about it also, there is this kind of similar work item linking feature, but it only triggers when the whole pipeline completes. So if you have a multi-stage YAML pipeline, you need to wait until the production last step goes through before any of the linking actually happens to the work items, which doesn't seem kind of fit for use or fit for purpose in that sense.
And I think this comes back into the initial question where we said that the built-in fits most of the cases. If you want to build something advanced, again, doesn't fit it. Most of my customers are using the work item linking to generate release notes. And normally you want to generate the release notes before you go to production. And just like, again, like, hey, makes sense. If you don't need that, you don't, like, it's not a blocker for you. So it's like these small things that are needed for certain kind of scenarios in a certain kind of processes. Would there be a different way to do it? Absolutely. But if you have to spend lots of time building it this way, it's very hard to switch it again. So I think that's where it finally comes down to, is that how much time have you spent on it, and are you willing to change your processes?
Yeah. Going back to GitHub a little bit, have you guys used the VS Code extension for that? Because I feel that that's very good when comparing to the Azure DevOps one. That kind of gives you everything you want with just the IntelliSense, and you can just click enter and go, kind of like Bicep, the Bicep VS Code extension. It's almost as good.
That's the power of community. I guess there's not that big of a community ready to contribute for Azure DevOps then.
Yeah.
I would say that the funny thing is, I think there's more users on Azure DevOps, but most of those users are not used to committing to tools. And then when you compare to GitHub, it's more like everybody's like, hey, this tool doesn't work. I go to source control, I submit a pull request, I fix it. Like it's different mentality. And I think that's a huge contributor on making it working like in every scenario.
It is when I look at the Azure DevOps marketplace, like I see that the extensions, like very rare is that they are kept up to date. Like many of them are like a few years old already, so they are not maintained very actively.
I think that the Azure DevOps Marketplace kind of doesn't bring up the GitHub repo side of the extension very well, so it doesn't kind of forward users to, hey, here's this GitHub repo, I should make an issue here. There's kind of no real kind of flow of users going there and perhaps even fixing their own issue.
Yeah. But I don't know how often you have fixed certain issues on those plugins. I have submitted few. Normally, I would say that if I submit a pull request, it takes around 1 to 2 months for them to getting integrated and fixed. For me, I think that's like, that kind of defeats the purpose. And the reason being is that it's just not the nature of the tool to be doing that. It's not meant for that. For example, like the whole publishing process, most of the plugins on Azure DevOps don't have a CI/CD pipeline for their plugin, which is kind of like that's kind of strange, but that's how it is.
Yeah. And also, if you think about kind of how Microsoft did with their docs, for example, they moved all of those to GitHub, and if you kind of see that they are kind of encouraging people to go make changes there, and I think that has worked.
Yeah, I think the documentation has improved hugely in the last few years even.
Yeah, so perhaps there's kind of a bit of a more of a need to Microsoft for, if they want to have those extensions be updated and so on, kind of make this a little bit easier for the users also. It might be that users still won't take up that kind of opportunity to participate, but at least it would be there kind of more visible.
And then I think one of the huge things there is that most companies publish their internal extensions. And then when on GitHub, it's more like, internal, what is that? Just push it to public. And like that way, like if you look at the amount of extensions on GitHub, it's massive. Like it's massive. Like if you do look like, how do I do this single thing? There's like 100 extensions doing exactly the one thing, but they're a little bit different, each of them. On Azure DevOps side, the nice thing is that if you look, there's only like one way to do it, which is like, this is again, which one you like? Do you like that there's lots of options, or do you like that there's one way to do it? I don't know. I personally like the GitHub way more, but That's my opinion.
Yeah, when I look at the Azure DevOps marketplace, for example, if I see an extension with kind of some random name, I look at how many people are actually using it, and the numbers are quite low, and that kind of makes me even less likely to actually use that extension there, even if it's the only way of doing it. Then I will probably take some PowerShell script and try to do it myself to make sure that it's actually at least my code that I'm running. So
Yeah.
But yeah, going back to kind of YAML West Classic a little bit, I feel that having those files in version control is still kind of the way of doing things. When your solution gets any larger than kind of this kind of hobby project or whatnot, you actually really want to be able to test your changes in your own branch, for example, which you cannot do with a classic pipeline. So that kind of brings you to a situation where you actually need to clone your classic pipeline and make the changes to actually test them. Then you need to make those changes again to the real pipeline if you want to actually commit them in. And if you have multiple stages, for example, let's say you have 3 environments, you need to make those changes 3 times, and that gets a little bit messy very quickly when you actually need to do that stuff. So I feel that GitHub is in the right direction in that sense that they only support the kind of YAML versions, as long as they kind of make it very easy to create them and upkeep them. And that kind of works into it when you have a lot of those public actions. You can directly look at the code, how to use this and how to actually create your own. So that's a very good benefit there.
No, I think that absolutely YAML is the way to go. It's not kind of yet there, and that's the big thing, is like not yet. Again, in a very near future, I would say YAML would be the recommendation. But
I when I started working with Azure DevOps and with the classic pipelines, that was like, it was really nice in the beginning.
Yes.
but then when you start building up, making more complex, you have more pipelines and everything, it becomes a real mess to maintain that. I mean, you make a small mistake somewhere, a config change, and you need to like really track it down. Where did I make it?
Yeah.
It's so hard. You have to do it from the UI and try to find it.
Indeed. But all right, let's move to a third subject then. Teemu, you were telling me one day that Azure DevOps is kind of reaching new heights in Finland in general. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Generally, I would say that I've been doing Azure DevOps for a long while. And before, it has always been like, when I go to companies, they're like, hey, this new project, let's put it on Azure DevOps. They've been like, Azure what? And I'm like, Azure DevOps. They're like, never heard. And they've always had some certain things like GitLab, GitHub, their own stuff, whatever, Bitbucket. And it's normally been like a team decision. What kind of tooling are we using? And now lately, I would say that there is more stronger, I would say, centralized focus on that there is a one tooling to do it. At certain point of time, I think it was more Atlassian focused. There was like a very huge push in Finland that Atlassian stack is a good one. I don't know if it's good or bad, but anyway, I do Azure DevOps. So Azure DevOps has been rising, I would say, last 2 years. It's been like, if you look at the companies using Azure DevOps, it's rising. If you look at the job opportunities, everybody's like now having like Azure DevOps. It's way more common these days. And the interesting thing is the tool is not new. There hasn't been any like, of course the YAML is new and that kind of stuff, but past 2 years, or let's just say 3 years, there hasn't been any like huge major changes, except that people have been finally starting to use the tool. And it's generally, I would say, it's the whole DevOps movement finally taking up and everybody moving there. But I would say that the Azure DevOps has been getting a really, really nice customers, getting more traction, getting more people talking about it. And of course, that makes me happy because that's the tooling that I have chosen to specialize on. So more users makes me more happy and more customers for me. But at the same time, I think that one of the there's 2 key factors why it has been so successful. One of them is Office 365. This is always like very funny when you're talking about this. Office 365 adaptation in Finland is one of the best in the world. I would say that I think it's more than 90% of medium-sized or large corporations are using Office 365. It might be even more higher than that. It's insane. like there is almost no Google companies unless you go into very special cases, enterprise, and then startups. That's basically where Google has been getting the Google suite going well. Everything else is basically Office 365. That brings in Azure Active Directory. And because Azure DevOps gets identities on Azure Active Directory, it's like, hey, one click, it's in use, it works, perfect. So I think that has been a huge driver, at least in Finland, of like why it has been succeeding. That's at least my opinion. How about you?
Yeah, I think that while everything you said is correct, my opinion is that the real kind of key to success is actually deciding on a name for the product after 4 iterations. So perhaps something like that. But yeah, I also think that Azure AD is the key to this whole thing, that kind of companies are using Azure DevOps primarily. And one other thing I think is that I was talking with one friend on Slack another day, and he was kind of thinking about his company, which had kind of parts in Azure DevOps and parts somewhere else. It's kind of easy to figure out kind of when you have everything of your tooling under one port. It's kind of a huge boon that Azure DevOps kind of brings you there. And if you think about kind of we have been talking about the kind of GitHub push here, it's even harder to kind of move there when if you think about maybe needing to move one piece at a time to GitHub, for example, you instantly lose that. So I think that's a huge benefit of Azure DevOps also. What about you, Masi?
I think there's been also a trend, at least in Finland, in the last years, of moving more into SaaS services in general, like concerning like version control. Like companies have been hosting their version controls themselves in GitLab or like Bitbucket, hosting on-prem, but then they've realized that, hey, we don't need to necessarily do this anymore. We can also use the SaaS version, which makes everything else even easier. Like integrating to Azure DevOps is much easier. You have Bitbucket Cloud is supported, GitHub is supported, so you have more options as well. So
Yeah,
I think that's one key driver has been also there.
and while I kind of don't believe that many of the Finnish customers, for example, think about this too much, Azure DevOps also brings you data sovereign. So basically, if you think about GitHub, for example, well, GitLab, if you are hosting your own Git, of course, you can decide where the data is, but with Azure DevOps, you can actually say that it will be in Europe, whereas in GitHub, well, it's somewhere, probably America.
And that's a real, I would say that because of the GDPR, it has been more attention brought in, like asking the questions, where is our data? So I think that's a actually partly. And then under, which is pretty interesting, is the Azure DevOps free. So if you start Azure DevOps without paying anything, you get 5 users and you get certain amount of build time. Which is a really, really nice way of getting started. Like, no need a credit card, no need to ask a boss, hey, can we get this bill approved or anything like that. You can just get started, no question asked, and you get it. Of course, like I think lately, one of the funny thing here is that because of the whole boom with Bitcoin, Azure DevOps build agents are not activated automatically anymore. You basically need to send an email, wait for 2 to 3 days, and then they're like, yeah, you seem like a real person. Here is your free build credits, just because it's just been abused too much. But I really think that has been a huge contributor on the uptake of it.
Yeah. And if you think about it, Microsoft houses often are doing like .NET development and that stuff, so they get Visual Studio subscriptions often from their enterprise agreement or some other way from Microsoft themselves. So that also provides you with the free license to Azure DevOps. So it can be that Azure DevOps is totally free for you, or you just pay for 1, 2 or so VMs for the build agents. But that's really a huge benefit there. And if you think about it, GitHub currently costs, I think it's $21 per user per month, so that's quite a lot more than free, at least. So.
It starts to add up quite heavily. Like you're more like, so this is free, that's costing thousands of euros a month. Is that much better? Probably not today. So yeah, I agree.
I mean, not to say that Azure DevOps doesn't have paid addition, like test plans, for example, and that's I think it's like 40 something euros a month. So that's kind of expensive too, but you can kind of figure out who actually needs that license. Not everybody does, so you can kind of automate that stuff away somewhat at least. All right, then maybe we should move to a little bit different subject, kind of DevOps with containers, AKS, Azure PaaS, so platform as a service. So we're thinking about discussing kind of if you're a startup or an enterprise or whatnot coming to Azure for the first time, kind of what should you actually choose for your platform and how do you actually make that decision? So perhaps let's start with a startup. I think Teemu, you might have most of experience with those guys. So, how do you think about this kind of solution or subject in general?
Yeah, so generally, like when you're talking with startups, I would always start with like, if we have an existing skill set, what is that? And normally, today, it's normally Kubernetes or containers. And then it comes to question like, how much experience do you have on running that Kubernetes or AKS or whatever container solution? And then it's more like, none. I've only been developing basically containers. And then it comes into the question, what do you want to focus? Do you want to focus on learning how to run your cluster and understanding it deeply, or do you want to focus on building your solution? And normally in a startup, it's more like, well, we have funding for 3 months, so we need a solution out very quickly. And then normally like my push is always Azure PaaS. Start with that. It's easier to get started. It works out of the box. Depending on your specific need, it might not 100% fit it. But anyway, you can get out of the door. It works. You can show to the customers. You can get enough money and funding to do the next thing. So absolutely 100% Azure PaaS. And then if you absolutely need something different, you can think about going for AKS or containers. I'm a huge believer of Azure PaaS. So I always think the layers are here. Azure PaaS, containers, virtual machines. And of course, then virtual machines on-prem is the lowest one. But basically, this is the ranking that where I put all the solutions in.
Yeah. You were mostly talking about kind of this goal of going to SaaS services in Finland. So I think that kind of does drive the companies maybe somewhat to PaaS also. But you were telling us earlier that you have been working with containers and PaaS together. So how have you done that?
I was about to ask Teemu that how do you then host Linux-based workloads in PaaS?
Azure Web App for containers.
Yeah, that's correct answer. But do you run it directly on the host, or do you containerize it? Because there's a big difference.
Whichever works.
Well, I would say it's like if you want 100% certainty, you will have to containerize it, because with Linux you never want to be tied to the underlying host directly. You want to have it in a container. So yeah, I've been in my current project. I've been running on Azure PaaS on web apps for containers, but also in containers. So we've been containerizing also the applications, and it doesn't take long to containerize an app. So once it's done, and it's also like a you have made the step already if you need to go to Kubernetes next. So you're kind of like, you have the readiness and you know that it can be run from a container already. So
and that kind of brings you the capability to kind of do a development process differently. If you have the code containerized, it might be easier to kind of everybody for use kind of the same tooling and whatnot. So that's at least a benefit. But if I think about kind of from my perspective, of course I'm a little bit biased here, but I like the PaaS kind of even native code on that. But of course we often do run kind of Windows-based code also. So that's of course a benefit. So. Yeah.
No, I think this is very much into what is your development stack, what is your experience, what is your target platform. If everything is Windows, don't put it in containers. like Windows, I don't know if you have run Windows containers, but I have done it a few times and we have migrated away from them very quickly. So if your target platform is Windows, don't containerize it. If your target platform is Linux, containerize it. If your target platform is PaaS, I would try to run it natively. If not, then I would containerize it. And this is all like, you make this kind of decision tree, and this will change within a time because, for example, the Windows containers, they're getting lots of new features. So maybe one day it would be like, yeah, it might be a good idea. And of course, there's always lots of scenarios where it makes sense. So for example, very lately we did this Windows Communication Foundation service. We had a very old code base. They wanted to put it on Azure. We containerized it and we put it on a web app. Worked perfectly. Straight out of the box. Great experience. We didn't need to touch any of the code. Everybody was like, nice. So, yep. It always depends. Like the normal consulting answer, it depends on what you have.
For our viewers here, what kind of problems have you faced with Windows containers then?
Mounting, boot up times, the sizes of the images. Then, for example, like if you want to run it on your local machine, you need to start it in a Windows mode. Then you cannot run Kubernetes anymore because Kubernetes is not supported if your master is in a Windows. Authentication. All of the guides are always for Linux. There is almost none of the guides for Windows.
What about logging?
Well, let's not talk about that. So there's a constantly like you can see that Windows stuff is not meant for it, and the Docker is not meant initially for the Windows. So Windows is lacking behind. This is the same as the YAML versus Classic. So feature parity is not there. And depending which features you need, it will hurt you a lot or it will not hurt you. But yeah, generally like. If you're doing new stuff, I would not put it on Windows containers. That's a absolutely 100% no. But if you're modernizing old stuff, absolutely fine to put it on Windows containers. The same thing is like I've not done this yet a lot, but you can run SQL Server on Linux, and the performance is really, really good. But just don't have that much experience on it except just doing some performance testing. So it a lot depends on your stack and decisions.
Yeah, now that GitHub Codespace is coming out at some point, I have been kind of thinking about how could we perhaps utilize that at Azure, for example. And while we probably won't be using Codespaces, I think developing in a container is an exciting idea that I want to kind of explore a little bit more. And that's at least kind of what I'm looking forward to testing. But Masi, how about enterprise kind of view then? Do you feel that it's kind of same approach to PaaS, AKS and containers than a startup, or is there some kind of difference?
Well, I totally agree with Teemu what he said about you need to find out what are the capabilities in the client or the company. I mean, running Kubernetes and maintaining it is not an easy task. Definitely. Yeah. It's not IaaS, but it's like somewhere between IaaS and PaaS. But you still need to be updating things or taking. Yeah, it requires some attention and also Linux expertise. So. So I also tend to tell the customers that if you don't want to be maintaining the Kubernetes cluster yourself, then it's better to go with PaaS, definitely.
Yeah, if I think about an enterprise kind of environment, they might have the manpower to actually upkeep the Kubernetes clusters. If you're a startup and thinking about the Kubernetes, you probably want to at least automate as much away as possible. And while that's true for enterprises also, at least they have the kind of brute force to get things going before they actually automate everything.
And it also, and even though they have the capability and they might have their own platform team who takes care of the Kubernetes clusters, but you also need to ensure that the team is able to do their deployments themselves. You build it, you run it. So you need to be able to run it yourself. So if their processes don't enable this, then I would still argue against and suggest going with the PaaS option. You don't have to host everything in Kubernetes, even though you have Kubernetes clusters.
That's a very good point.
And I think one of the major concerns with PaaS has always been that I might want to run this someday for on-prem, or I might have this one customer who wants it on-prem, but that one customer is huge enough that we are absolutely going to do it. And that has always been I would say, very hard thing to argue against. There hasn't been a good way to say, if you're running this in Pasi and you're not containerizing it, how do I do this?
Yeah.
And this far, there hasn't been a good story here. Now, finally, in the build, there has been Azure Arc, which has a great promise of fixing all of this. The main idea is I think it's super amazing. The whole idea is that you have a Kubernetes cluster on-prem, and you deploy the Azure PaaS into your Arc cluster on-prem, and then you can use Azure APIs to deploy it, the web app, and it looks exactly that the location instead of being East Europe or West Europe or anything, it's your on-prem location, and it just goes there magically. And it sounds magic, and my experience on testing it for a few days have been, when it works, it's magic. When it doesn't work, there is quite many layers of trying to understand that, is this a Kubernetes problem? Is this a network problem? Is this a PaaS problem? Is this your packaging problem? And you're like, yay, so there is a multiple layers. But at the same time, I'm super excited about that. I think like that opens up so many new possibilities. And the nice thing here is that, especially when you talk about Azure DevOps side of things, nothing changes. The way how you deploy it, instead of having West Europe there, you just change the string to being saying my dungeon or whatever, my farm, and there it goes.
Yeah.
The promise is amazing.
Yeah, and I think that Azure Arc is kind of misunderstood as a product in general, and customers kind of need to understand that your VMs or whatnot, Kubernetes cluster, they can be actually be anywhere. They can be in different clouds or on-premise or on some ship somewhere in the Arctic Ocean, and everything works with kind of the Azure kind of tooling, which allows you to standardize on an enterprise level very well. So I think that it's kind of most of the problem here being, again, that there's a bit of a steeper learning curve than with PaaS. You still need to run your Kubernetes clusters yourself, and doing that on some ship somewhere might be a little bit hard. I haven't done it, so but that's kind of my hunch. but still, it allows you to kind of at least standardize most of the workflow for your applications. And I mean, before you could have done stuff like functions runtime on a container somewhere, but that's kind of still something a little bit different. You don't get the operational or management plane of Azure included in that. And now there have been kind of this, for example, KEDA, which is this kind of auto-scaling block on top of Kubernetes that kind of, I think, Azure Arc actually builds upon.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think at least the web app on Azure Arc isn't built on top of KEDA or something that's very close to that. But I mean, like, that's exactly the things that I think that brings value. That's one of those things that I think that brings something new to the table that has not been there before. So exactly, like that's the thing is that I'm really looking forward to how will this exactly work, especially because I think Azure Arc now supports API management, web apps, and was messaging there, Service Bus?
I think it was, but I'm not 100% certain. Do you, Masi?
I haven't checked.
But basically the whole thing is that the more PaaS services come to Arc, the more interesting it becomes. Because soon, hopefully one day, there will be a solution where you can just decide that, hey, do I want to run this on Azure, or do I want to run this whole thing on my on-prem? And that is exactly the answer that, when there's like, I have this one customer, like, we have a perfect solution for that one customer. And even though, like, the best thing here is that you can build for everybody else, you can build completely Azure PaaS native solution, and for that one scenario, you can then deploy the same thing there. You don't need to do separate testing, you don't need to have a separate code bases, you don't need to have a separate pipelines. It just basically makes everything so much easier. That's why I'm so excited about it.
Yeah.
But I'm not 100% sure about the hybrid connectivity story. That does it work over the private networking? Like if I have my Kubernetes cluster on-prem and I want to deploy from Azure Arc, does it require some public IPs in the on-prem side, or will it just flow there?
So the documentation is very, I would say, non-existent.
I think that part is, once they get that part like solid, then it's like then it can be really.
I would say very exciting. I would not put production on it.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe, but with lots of like this, like disclaimers that we need to really test this.
Yeah.
But I would say exciting, super exciting.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think it's still in preview now.
Yep.
Is it private or public?
Public.
Yeah. So let's say if we think about how long those have often taken before going to GA, it might be year or two before it's really supported for production, but it doesn't mean that you can't test it. And I think some companies in Finland have already been using this for their kind of almost production work, if I'm not mistaken.
I think that Azure Arc might be in a preview for a very short time or very long, but I would be betting more on the long time because it's a huge change on like so many layers that I would be very surprised if it's out of the preview within a year. I would be more expecting it to be out somewhere next summer, so next build. I think that time frame.
I just wonder how it's going to be comparing with Azure Stack. Like what's going to
happen?
What
is the Stack?
What is going to happen to Azure Stack once they get that ready?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that it will be interesting to see when you get these kind of messaging services and kind of more complex services on Kubernetes, because you can actually see what's in those namespaces. You can actually see how they actually work on the back end, which might then help you perhaps troubleshoot something that you probably shouldn't be the one troubleshooting, but still, it's at least interesting to me to see how.
Like for example, Azure API management. Being able to take that beast from Azure to on-prem has been a question multiple times. Of can we take this? Now it's like, yeah, you can take it. I would still not want to be the one taking it to the on-prem, but hopefully, because Azure API management is an amazing service, but at the same time, it's one of the most complex services on Azure, especially when we talk about DevOps. I mean, seriously, like everything else is more like, yeah, we can very quickly do it. But if somebody brings up Azure API management, I was like, so this is going to take a few sprints.
Let's make it internal mode.
Yes.
Do you, Masi, have any personal experience?
Yes, I do.
On that? Do you want to tell us any stories and what has gone wrong? I have kept my hands pretty clean.
I can tell that the high availability part of the story is tricky.
No.
That part is tricky, because then you need to really like start thinking about, okay, I need multiple instances in different regions, so I need to start like supporting multiple regions, so it gets like it gets quite complicated.
Yeah, and I think that also when you take a look at how do you actually manage those APIs that are running on there on the or the JSON files that should be deployed there, so it's already the kind of deployment flow is pretty different from any other Azure service, and it kind of requires you to think how are kind of teams even structured around that, because it's a centralized service for your company. So how do you actually protect that and so on, and who has the keys to the car basically? So that's stuff that I don't really want to think about, but somebody has to. All right. Then Azure Arc basically has these kind of how do you actually manage those clusters? So behind the scenes, it actually uses this GitOps kind of way of working, which kind of means that you have a Git repository which has the source of truth for your cluster, and you might have kind of these files there that say that this is this cluster's configuration, this is other clusters. But basically, if you make a PR to that cluster, you get kind of this state change there also. So have you guys worked with GitOps, and do you have any experience with how that works?
Well, not with Kubernetes, but
no.
Yeah. But with like, I mean, you can also do with YAML pipelines pretty far in GitOps way, definitely.
It's true. Yeah. I feel that I've been looking at it for the last couple of months maybe now, and I feel that from a Kubernetes perspective, that's probably the way to go forward, because if you think about what's your Kubernetes deployment about, it probably has tons and tons of microservices, for example, running, and if you are doing kind of push deployments there, it gets pretty messy pretty quickly. So I think that GitOps is kind of the way to go there, but it's also quite complicated, and it seems that there isn't really these kind of ways of working yet. How do you structure that repository and so on? But I was kind of glad to see in the Arc demo that the person showing it kind of just plugged in his or her Git repo into one of the clusters, and the kind of same configuration replicated to all of the clusters for that company. So that's kind of, if you have multiple AKS clusters or whatnot, GitOps is probably something that you need to
definitely
think
it's something you definitely need to use. I mean, it's not manageable.
Yeah.
The promise of it is great. Don't have a personal experience yet. We'll have it in a few months, but not yet.
Yeah. It does kind of bring you some problems, like it's easy to create long-running branches for your different environments, and it kind of needs you to think a little bit differently, because you need to have your dev and test and production, for example, side by side, because they live side by side also at the same time. So how do you actually do kind of the linking of your actual application code with that kind of cluster configuration? And that brings a little bit of complexity.
Yeah, I think it mainly comes down to, do you need to support multiple versions at the same time of your app?
Yeah.
Like, can you only run one version, the latest version, or do you need to support multiple side by side?
Yeah, it kind of, for me, it kind of gets to the point that when I start to look at some AK stuff, I always have like, here's 15 new services that you need to learn right away. You've never heard of the names, but they are the right ones to use.
and every year it's always like the new 15 services.
Yeah.
Like, these were the previous good ones. Now there is this new set of them. I mean, they are getting better and better. I mean, the Kubernetes tooling are getting better and better every iteration. But I think it's a little bit too many iterations. Like there is constantly new iteration. I don't know. Some people might like that. I'm very happy that Azure Web App has been basically, like, behind the hood, it's been changing a lot, but from a user perspective, it's looking and behaving the same way since 5 years ago, and I'm very happy about that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move to our potentially last subject here for today. And it was basically infrastructure branching strategies, and maybe infrastructure as code in general. So kind of choosing the right strategy for the job. Let's say you might be an enterprise or a startup, and you might handle your infrastructure as code perhaps kind of separately from the code. So how do you actually tackle that, and is that the right way to do things, and how should you do that? So Teemu, do you want to give any thoughts on kind of how to start, and what would be your kind of starting point?
Sure, and I think this comes very much into responsibility separation. One of the things is that if you have a different team that does networking, for example, that's very common, is that in an enterprise you have a different team that does networking. Then you should have one repository that contains all the networking stuff, but then you might have a separate application teams which have an access to certain part of the networking. And then it gets very interesting, like how much are you sharing, how are you sharing it? And this is all then, of course, coming back into what is your Azure networking strategy. Are you doing hub and spoke? Are you doing GAF? For example, I'm a huge fan of GAF. I'm one of those persons who believes that more subscriptions is better. And the latest version of GAF is basically every application and every environment should be a separate subscription.
Before we go further, would you like to tell us what GAF is for you?
Yes. So Cloud Adaptation Framework, which is basically how you should be using Azure for your needs. It's a huge set of certain like guiding principles, guiding architecture. Lots of it is good. I don't like some parts of it. It's the same as like any kind of like, the Scrum or Safe. There's lots of good stuff, and then there's lots of not so good stuff. And always, depending on what you're doing and how you're using it, certain parts make more sense to you than others. But the nice thing there is that I think that it has lots of things like ready-made. You just take it in and start using it. So that's the big thing on there, is that networking. So it's separate, and normally like how we do it, or how I've been like guiding it, is that we keep the hub networking in a separate repository where everybody might have a read access, and then they can do a pull request, but they cannot accept the pull request. So then the networking people like, hey, you want to make a routing change? We need absolutely that person to accept it. And this is exactly the things that you can build on Azure DevOps, where you say, if this certain file gets modification, this person needs to approve it. This is like when it comes back to like what you can do on GitHub and what you cannot do on Azure DevOps. Azure DevOps supports this, so you can do this very complicated things to saying like this file contains or routing tables. Only this person or this group can approve changes on it. And I think that's the thing is that we have been doing. Then when it comes to branching strategy, normally we have been doing is that in a networking, we normally don't have a develop and a master. Because the problem is that they are normally interconnected, meaning that when you do changes in develop, we don't use branching because we don't have a full set of the network as a developer environment. So we have all the networking stuff in a one branch. Then when it comes to, let's just say, API management and those, then we always have a master and development, and you first do changes in development and then you go to master or main, depending which branching naming convention we are using, just to be way more confusing than needs to be. But normally, networks, one branch. Other stuff, normally 2 branches at least, depending more environments, more things.
Yeah, sounds like the networking part is kind of following kind of the GitHub principles that we just talked about. One question that comes to mind is that do those people then have some kind of automated way of testing those network changes, for example, before they approve, or is it just something that this guy knows if it breaks something or not?
So that's a very interesting thing. Let's just say for a routing example, it's very hard to test the routing before you make the change.
Yes.
So what we did is that you approve it, and then we run tests, and then it will automatically roll back. Because we just couldn't basically duplicate enough. We tried, and then we decided we are not going to do it because it would have been too massive thing to replicate the whole networking setup. So we just basically created a set of automation tests that are running. Mainly they are basically pinging from on-prem to cloud and then from cloud to on-prem, testing, for example, private links, DNS resolutions, and then everything works, ready to go. I would have liked it to be that we are testing it in separate, like a total isolation, and then we are deploying, but we didn't find a good way to do it. So now it's more like, that's why we only have a certain people, because otherwise we could make it so that, it's fully automated process. Once it's done, we could merge it. But now it's more like there needs to be a human who makes the decision that is this something that we want to do, and when do we want to try this out? Not the perfect, but
I was looking at Mark Russinovic's one keynote from some conference, maybe Ignite last year, and he was talking about this Chaos Studio, which is kind of allowing, perhaps in the future, sometime doing chaos testing. So perhaps that's something that could be used to kind of test those changes beforehand. So kind of introduce that as kind of fault in your system to see if it actually breaks anything. So.
But I have a question. How do the developers know what IP space they can request for?
Oh, so we had this IP space manager thingy, and that was automated. This was more about routing, and there was a very few scenarios where developers need to change the routing, the core routing. Normally, like the reasons why you're changing is that you're introducing a new region, or you're introducing a new firewall, or you're doing something strange, like creating a new load balancer or ingress or something like that. And normally it's always done by the core networking because it was too complicated and not well documented. And normally also because it's normally has something to do with on-prem. And then it becomes like, how well do you understand the on-prem and the Azure? And the same thing is like why I think the JS Studio might not be the solution, is that the Azure part is very easy to duplicate or replicate or create a new environment. But then we come to on-prem, it's like, so how many on-prem data centers do you have that you can replicate? Well, not enough. So yeah, that was the issue.
You need to onboard them into Azure Arc first. So.
Yeah, but they still need to build a separate Azure Arc data center just for my testing. I don't think that they would be like, yeah, let's do it.
Is that too much to ask? Come on.
Yes, I think it is.
I mean, you have the Kubernetes cluster. Just give us access there,
Yeah.
so we can use it.
Yeah, normally this is all about like express routes and VPNs and all of those. So it's not like, just few servers. It's more like, well, we need this whole routing tables and we need a second location and, testing this kind of very complicated express route stuff and everything. So, but okay, this always depends. But networking is something that I see as a special case. Everything else should be following the normal stuff.
Yeah.
And then lately, I've been I've been a huge fan of ARM templates. I've been talking about that a lot.
Same,
and
yeah.
I've been thinking that this is absolutely 100% the way to go. I don't believe in Pulumi. I don't believe in Terraform. I don't believe in whatever else you're doing. Azure CLI, PowerShell. No. ARM template. Way to go. But lately, I saw I've been a little bit involved with Bicep on the council stuff, and then I haven't yet before I used it in production. But then you had a nice session about it that it's almost production ready, and then there was a really good session on build on it, and I finally started to use it, and I think it's amazing. I think you were absolutely 100% right. It's the way to go.
Yeah, we might make some people angry with these comments, but I also do believe that if you're doing Azure, use Bicep.
Yes.
But of course, there are reasons why you would choose Terraform or Pulumi, but if you are starting on Azure, at least try Bicep first and see how it feels. But of course, I kind of feel that you can do this stuff with any tool you choose.
Yeah.
It might just be easier with one tool over the other. But Masi, have you been using Bicep, or how do you usually do this kind of Azure things?
I started with ARM when I started doing Azure, but then I've shifted into Terraform.
Yeah.
So I have some view on both, and I think that the biggest challenge with ARM is that it just doesn't support all the scenarios. So you have to stitch things anyway. With Terraform, I can do a lot more. So there's a huge community working on the Terraform providers, and you can do it doesn't just restrict into Azure. So you can it's multi-cloud, and it's even you can even provision resources into the Kubernetes clusters themselves. So it kind of it's more flexible.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that is a good point. For me, I just feel that I don't want to manage that state myself. Even though I have done it a couple of times, it always feels like such a chore. If I break it, there's kind of huge panic on how do I get this back. I, of course, don't back up anything that I have. So.
There's ways to manage it.
Yeah.
No, I think again, it's all about all the tools are good. The thing is that you have lots of choices. It's just that I personally have a preference on my tooling. There's a lot of ways to do CI/CD.
Yeah.
I have a one way, and it's the same thing. There's multiple ways to provision your infrastructure. Yesterday it was ARM, now it's a Bicep. But anyway, I think there is a certain things that if you specialize on something, then you can really get good at it. For example, ARM template, lots of people are saying that it has lots of constraints. You cannot do that, you cannot do this. I would say that's wrong. Most things you can do. Let's just not say how hard it is. You can do it, but it might be really, really, really complicated. Which might be one line in a Terraform. It's 100 lines in ARM and lots of debugging.
And you still use it.
Absolutely, because I have chosen my tool. No, and and that's exactly a good thing is that why I use ARM. I have spent so much time on it that I know how to use it. I have ready-made templates. I have, I do understand very deeply how to debug the ARM problems, how to develop linked templates, nested templates, how do you mix match them, how do you wait for certain things. Yeah. And I mean, I would not recommend anybody to today doing that when you can just use Bicep and get all of it for free or Terraform. And this is always when did you start? How much time did you spend on it? And that's basically coming into questions what tooling should you use?
Yeah. And if we actually take one small step backwards, because we didn't actually explain what Bicep is. So Bicep is kind of the new Azure native tool that it seems that Microsoft has taken. It's a Microsoft tool, but they have kind of taken it as the primary tool almost on doing things already. So what it does is that you have this DSL, so domain-specific language, that kind of compiles into ARM templates, and then you deploy either the ARM templates or the Bicep files themselves. the compilation happens somewhere in the background, but you basically get a lot better intelligence than with ARM templates you used to have, and basically it's kind of very easy to understand on what's happening on those templates. But as Masi said, kind of Bicep and ARM, they are scoped to Azure and the Azure kind of management plane and the resource plane there, and not necessarily what's happening inside those resources, which can be a good or a bad thing depending on how kind of thin you want to push the certain tooling. So maybe you might want to have a secondary tool for doing that stuff, maybe not, but it's kind of a matter of experience. So if you're coming from AWS and you have everything in Terraform, maybe that's not a good way to move to Bicep then for Azure, because you have those kind of processes already done there. But other than that, yeah.
And I think one of the massive things which hasn't been that maybe visible is that when Microsoft's doing this Bicep thing, they also changed it so that the Bicep is fully automatically generated based on the open API specifications of the Azure resources, and they were bad before. They were really missing things. People were not documenting things well there. And during this whole Bicep transformation, they went to each team and told them, you need to fix this. Because we are going to automatically generate, we are not going to do many manual changes. All the documentation is going to be automatically generated. So all of the teams, if you look at the API versions, a lot of them have a very new version. And that's because that's where they really, really fix these things. And that's why Bicep is also very nice to use. The documentation is way better. Is that this is not just, Bicep thingy. It's basically a huge, huge movement driven by the Bicep. And this will, in the long run, also make Terraform way better. We will see a huge improvement over the whole IAC thingy just because of this movement.
We will link the build presentation in the show notes after this session is over, so you can take a look at that. And if you want to see my presentation on it, just look at the FAUG channel here that you're looking at right now and see kind of how Bicep works. But I think that intelligence is really the key here also, because it can pull from the APIs, it can get most of the required details, for example, and examples on what should you fill in some certain thing. So you end up looking a lot less into the documentation of the kind of resource provider itself, and kind of not just writing your code as you go on. So it's a lot more efficient on working with that. How do you feel, Masi, with the Terraform kind of tooling? Do you get intelligence from the APIs directly, or how much time do you actually spend on looking at documentation itself?
Well, I do always look at the documentation mostly. Right. I do have intelligence, but I always want to first check that what does the documentation say, because it's just easier to do it right the first time. But
that's true.
But I agree. There's ARM has maybe a bigger learning curve, but then with Terraform you will end up figuring out some other kind of issues. So they both have their pros and cons, I would say. Yep. But coming back to the branching strategy, we didn't really talk about that. But I was just in my current project. Just want to tell you a bit about it, because it was interesting to see that we had kind of like a greenfield project, and we had all the skills in the team needed. So we started off with the monorepo. We are still with the monorepo, but but for the release process, we ended up shifting from GitHub flow to more like a release flow. I don't know if you are familiar with the Microsoft's definition of release flow, but we are quite close to that now, actually. Except that we are always abandoning the release branches. We are not merging those back to the master.
Yeah, I think we should probably explain what the release flow is, but we use release flow as our default for all kind of projects that we do. So I have found that it's very good.
Yeah.
So basically what happens there is that you have a kind of trunk-based development flow. So you have a master, you create feature branches from that and merge them into master. And then let's say whenever you want to release, be it once every sprint or fast or whatever, you create kind of a release branch from the master. That's a short-lived kind of release branch. You deploy it to production, make any hot fixes, basically either from master on the release flow or the release branch itself, and then you basically abandon the release flow once all the hotfixes have also been merged into or cherry picked into the master again.
Yeah, one maybe really positive surprise I found out is like with the Azure repos, the cherry picking. It really works.
Yeah.
I mean, it really like the developer don't need to worry about something going wrong with the version control. They just cherry pick from Azure DevOps, and you can be sure that it ends up in the right place.
Yeah.
So that takes a lot of burden away from there.
I think Azure Repos does a very good kind of work on demystifying Git a little bit with just buttons that you can click.
Yeah.
You always know that this will happen and so on.
It's the same thing, like the pull request flow is really nice. The cherry picking is really nice. The code reviews, I really like the way how you can do code reviews and the whole commenting stuff.
Yeah.
And I like the interesting thing is I would say most of those are in a GitHub also.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure which one made them first. Was it GitHub first and then Azure DevOps adopted them or how it went? But I think that they are way better on the web than on the CLI, for example. Like I hate to do it on CLI. Like cherry picking, like no, just no.
Yeah, but like I was previously a bit scared about cherry picking, but now it doesn't scare me anymore because I can know that it gets right.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, well, I'm not sure if GitHub has this, but I think that in Azure DevOps or Azure Repos, if you're doing the merging of a pull request, you also have a conflict extension that you can kind of merge your conflicts directly on the UI. So that is very easy to just click that I want this, and it happens for you. But yeah. But I haven't worked with kind of those platform ops type of repos too much myself, but I think that what I feel is the right way of doing those kind of infrastructure kind of branching is basically the GitOps way. So master branch is basically the source of truth. But of course, it's always when you have this trunk-based development flow, it kind of means that you do need to have some automated testing to kind of verify those changes, and that's kind of the hard part and does require some work. So maybe if you have multiple branches, well, I think there's always the problem of having kind of long-lived branches, multiple, and that might cause some Git issues for you pretty easily. But of course, it's kind of a balancing act on what's enough work or too much work for you to actually implement the testing, for example. Yeah, but of course you will notice the errors when you go to production with either either solution, but still, and I kind of feel that if you have any code, you should have your kind of infrastructure as code alongside that code in the same branch, in the same repository, and so on. So everything in that same package kind of lives together with each other. Yeah. All right. Anything else from this subject? We are kind of closing to our time here. So, any closing thoughts, Masi?
No, I'm actually just interested to see how will this GitHub story evolve.
Definitely.
That's like one of the big questions for the following years.
Yeah. I'm also quite excited to get to use GitHub Actions more because we didn't talk about it too much, but basically the triggering from anything that happens on GitHub is kind of very cool. You no longer need to think of an outside automation on top of your kind of product. You can just create a GitHub action for that, create an issue resolution or assignment or code scans or whatnot. Anything that happens on GitHub will trigger action if you want.
Yeah, that's a very nice promise.
Yeah. I think generally I'm very excited about Bicep and I'm very excited about Arc. And of course keep using Azure DevOps. I mean, I absolutely see that GitHub Actions and GitHub overall is something that I will be using more in the future, but I don't see any huge migrations coming or like all of the stuff moving there, but I see it as an interesting way of seeing what's going to be coming. Is on the GitHub, especially like the GitHub Actions, for example. I think that's more of the very nice things, especially on the workflow kind of things. So those excite me a lot for the future.
All right. hey, with this we will leave you for the summer, and Finland Azure User Group will come back in, let's say, September earliest. We'll see about that after the summer. But thanks everyone for joining this panel, and see you after the summer vacations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.